Hello, everyone, and welcome. Before we get started, we have a couple of housekeeping notes. First, we respect your time, and we are going to do our best to get through this informative discussion within 60 minutes, and that's going to include Q&A. Speaking of Q&A, questions are welcomed. Be sure to write them and ask them in the Q&A and not the chat. That way, our administrator will be sure to see them, and we will address many of the questions at the end of this discussion. And finally, select full screen for the best view. We are going to be recording this discussion, and we're going to be providing a link to everyone via email in the days to come. All right, it's 1 o'clock my time, 10 o'clock on the West Coast. Let's go ahead and get started. Today we are covering cybersecurity assessments, what they are and why your company should have one, presented by Xantrion and the Maynard Nexsen law firm. My name is Heather Hoops Matthews. I am a recovering journalist and your moderator today. I have the honor of leading NP Strategy, a strategic PR firm made up of about 30 professionals across 4 states. We help companies navigate challenges such as a cybersecurity event or leverage opportunities, maybe a company expansion, through public relations services such as media relations, message development, crisis communications, and much more. And I should note, NP Strategy is a wholly owned subsidiary of the Maynard Nexsen law firm. All right, let's meet our panelists. First with us today is Brandon Robinson. Brandon is a cybersecurity and data privacy attorney with Maynard Nexsen. Now, this is a national law firm with more than 550 attorneys and 24 offices coast to coast. Brandon serves companies across many industry sectors that need legal counsel on the full range of a company's data lifecycle. He assists on the proactive side with risk mitigation and regulatory issues, as well as on the reactive side, helping when a cybersecurity event occurs. Our next panelist is Darren Nyberg. He is the Vice President of Client Strategy at Xantrion, a managed IT and cybersecurity service provider. Darren's deep experience in IT provides a valuable backdrop for his work at Xantrion, where he helps companies develop IT strategies, including building out IT roadmaps, proactive monitoring, managing security, cloud strategies, and backup and recovery. Thank you, Darren and Brandon, for joining us today. And Darren,
thank you for having us.
Since we just heard your bio, we're going to start with you. First question, tell us, what is a cybersecurity assessment?
Thanks for the introduction. So starting with the basics, a cybersecurity assessment is a thorough review of your company's cybersecurity program. It's a gut check of where you are today, where you'd like to go tomorrow, accompanied with a plan from how to get from point A to point B. So there should be a myriad of technical controls and policies and procedures that you're going to review as part of this. This is your logical access, your disaster recovery, and your incident management.
I like how you use the term gut check. It's probably something that we do and we don't want to know. Brandon, how does legal counsel play a role here?
Sure, thank you, Heather. From a legal perspective, we're often looking at some of the less technical issues involved in cyber risk. Not so much which specific technologies you're investing in, which firewall is the best, but more around what policies and procedures are being designed and implemented to govern the use of those technologies. And then also how cyber risk is being addressed at the organizational level in terms of oversight and accountability. And of course, how that may or may not comply with any legal or regulatory requirements or even best practices. So it's definitely a Venn diagram with some overlap between technical and legal. For example, you definitely want both your technical and legal experts reviewing your incident response plan or your information security policy. But it also may extend to other things like policies governing social media use, employee training and awareness, the company's privacy policy and vendor agreements, or even the company's organization or governance structure and how it allocates responsibility.
And I think for our participants, you're going to continue to see, as both of them talk today, because we've practiced more than once, that you're going to see their roles and how they're unique, but how they really work well together. So let's move from the what to the why. Darren, from a proactive standpoint, tell us why a company would need a cybersecurity assessment.
Yeah, there's plenty of reasons why a company might explore a proactive cybersecurity assessment. Cybersecurity threats are constantly evolving. It's a little bit of a moving target, so you need to evolve with it, alongside it. It's a must this day and age to ensure that you're staying on top of this and evolving with the threat landscape. Used to be that all you needed was a strong password and a hardened firewall. 6 characters, maybe it's complex, and a new firewall that's patched with some regularity. Then it was that was no longer the case, right? That was no longer good enough. And then all you needed was multi-factor. That was kind of like the saving grace. It prevented a lot of the bad actors from getting into your environment. And for many years, that was the one thing you really needed to do to make your environment bulletproof. And unfortunately today, multi-factor authentication alone doesn't match some of the more sophisticated and yet increasingly more accessible attacks that we see out there. So you just got to stay on top of it and evolve with it. Perhaps your company has either recently moved a bunch of data into a cloud or incorporated some new technology that you want to make sure your policies and procedures match this increase of risk exposure. So you have to get those up to date. Or perhaps it's been a long time since you've brushed off your policies and looked at this, and you want to pull it out of the closet, brush it off, and review it because it's become a little bit stale.
Brandon, from a reactive standpoint, we don't like to think that can happen, but it obviously, it does happen with more frequency. Tell us why we would need an assessment from a reactive standpoint.
Sure. Obviously, we would always encourage clients to be proactive in their cybersecurity assessments and improvements and do it on the front end. But when we say there may be reactive reasons for cybersecurity assessments, typically what we mean is there is something that has happened or something that exists to which the company is now responding to do an assessment in response to that thing. And it could be a number of reasons or a combination of those. It could be a new legal regulatory requirement that now you must do cyber assessments on a periodic basis. It may be a contractual provision that you're a vendor to another company and they require that you do periodic assessments. Or unfortunately, it may be a recent incident where you've had something that has occurred and you've suffered through the expense and the burden of that incident, and you're looking to improve your cybersecurity posture to avoid that in the future. So for example, if your company may be subject to some of the new comprehensive privacy laws in Virginia, Colorado, and California, or GDPR in Europe, that's an example of a legal requirement that requires that companies undergo data protection impact assessments. California requires it annually. Colorado and Virginia require it if processing presents a certain heightened risk. Also, HIPAA requires for healthcare providers, health plans, and others that handle PHI or protected health information, it requires what's called privacy impact assessments when you have a new IT system or technology. Similarly, Gramm-Leach-Bliley's safeguards rule, which applies to financial institutions, requires regular risk assessments to evaluate the security of its customer information. So finally, you may not be a healthcare entity or a financial institution or have a legal requirement, but maybe you're a vendor to customers who are. And so in your contracts or in the RFPs that you're responding to, they flow down that requirement to you as part of their own compliance.
Such a complex and changing industry that both of you are working in. We've talked about the what, we've talked about the why. We're going to drill down now a little bit more into the weeds and talk about the different types of assessments. Darren, can you walk us through them?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's a handful of different types of assessments out there. Self-assessments, they're exactly as described. They're fine in a pinch to give you kind of a quick sense of how you're doing, but you may not be the right person to answer many of these questions. You may not be an expert and may not understand what it's asking. You also have a little bit of a conflict of interest. You may skew the results to look more favorably because you want to come out more favorably. So again, you're not the right person to necessarily be in the best spot to assess your technical controls and your cybersecurity policies. But it's not a bad thing to do if that's the only thing you're doing. It's better than nothing. Similarly, automated scans, better than nothing, but there are some gaps there. These are tools that scan bits of your environment for vulnerabilities or best practices. Typically paint an incomplete picture, however. Sometimes they're coupled with a self-assessment, so you would do both of them in tandem. But similar to self-assessments, you're not the expert. So this automated scan is going to spit out some results, and you're going to have to interpret those results. And you're going to have to understand, okay, it looks like some of these results are pretty bad. I should probably spend some energy and some time on fixing those things. But perhaps that's misguided and you're misplacing your energy. And there's some other things and some gaps that weren't covered in that automated scan that you really needed to uncover. So again, you're not the right person to do this, and you may not be putting your effort in the right place based on the outcome of that scan. So the gold standard, the best, is a third-party assessment. So this is the best of the three options on the table. This is the most involved option, however. It will consume more of your company's time, more of your resources. However, there's no substitute for having someone with expertise to review your environment, someone who has gone through this before and implements this and manages this at other clients.
And we saw on the previous slide the potential cost of a cybersecurity event. So I hear you say this will take more time and more money to have the ideal methodology, but it's far less than an actual breach.
Correct. Yeah.
Correct. Brandon, give us your legal perspective here.
Sure. When we get involved in an assessment from a legal perspective, our approach is first we want to do a kickoff call with the company. We want to introduce the team on our side. We want to talk about what individuals on their side might need to be involved. Often we're bringing in a technical vendor like Xantrion alongside us, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. Because the assessment can be scalable or in phases, depending on the company's needs, its priorities, its budget, and other factors. So we want to make sure we get the scoping right, and we've got buy-in from everybody that would need to be a part of the assessment. And then often, as I said, we would proceed in phases. So first, we'd have a series of questions that we ask the company to understand it and its practices better, understand its industry, its geographic location, what specific types of data they process and who they share it with, et cetera. Then we'd ask for key documents, such as privacy policies, incident response plans, other documents. And if we find that such documents don't exist, then we've identified some threshold issues right there. In the second phase, we might dig a little bit deeper. We'd look into their vendor agreements and the documents themselves to see what protections are in place in their supply chain to identify compliance gaps or areas for improvement. And then finally, in maybe a third phase, we could go about actually developing and refining those documents, maybe conducting training and awareness to the organization and its employees, and making other recommendations as needed for either compliance reasons or best practices. And then finally, something I want to emphasize that we've mentioned a little bit, but which is contained in the last bullet on our slide here. Technical vendors offer a great amount of expertise and a lot of value, and legal experts do too. But it's important to understand, in my opinion, that the technical and the legal are not completely separate lanes that exist in a vacuum. To the contrary, the technology that you invest in and your policies around how you use that technology and the limitations on them are very interdependent. And so it's not an either or decision, but it's a yes and decision. And that is to say that the ideal assessment, in addition to what Darren said, that third-party assessments are really ideal, even more ideal is where you have a comprehensive assessment, where legal and technical experts are working together to identify in a comprehensive and holistic way what issues may exist, and then suggest recommendations for the company's consideration that take all of that into account.
Brandon, I'm going to ask you a question, but before I do it, I want to remind all of our attendees that in the Q&A, if you have questions, to go ahead and start putting those in, and we will address them at the end. But one quick thought comes to mind. You said an assessment could take phases. Could you give us an idea of like how long something like this might take?
Sure. And it depends, of course, on the scale of the company, the amount of data it goes through, its industry, and lots of other factors. But that's why we break it up into those pieces. So a typical assessment in phase one, where we're just identifying issues, might take a matter of weeks. If it's more involved in terms of phase 2 or 3, it might take a matter of months. But that's why it's important to have that initial kickoff call so that everybody understands sort of the scoping and the time frame, so that we can move at the pace that the company needs.
All right. Thank you for that. Darren, let's talk about how the cybersecurity assessments are structured.
Sure. So typically you don't want to reinvent the wheel here. There's plenty of well-known and trusted frameworks out there. Most of them cover similar sets of technical controls and offer benefits to various industries. Xantrion uses the NIST framework, but there's a lot of others out there. There's the CIS framework, that's ISO 27001, HIPAA. There's a lot of other frameworks out there that exist that allow you to match your technology controls against what they see as best practices. And there's a ton of overlap between these different sets of between these different frameworks. So we picked NIST. That's the one we've landed on. But coupling a framework with experts in the field who have helped deploy and manage that framework is really the best practice and how we attack this problem.
All right. Well, when the rubber hits the road, it's like, what does this look like in action? We're going to move on to some case studies. The first one is from Xantrion, and Darren, walk us through it, please.
Sure. So one of our clients, it's a 60-person financial advisor with a bit over $13 billion in assets under management, approached us because they wanted to kind of gut check where they were today. We've been managing their IT and their cybersecurity for some time, and we think we have a pretty good program put together, but they wanted to make sure that it was adhering to a standard set of controls as well. So their desired outcome was to simply pass and make sure that we were kind of at a good, healthy baseline. So we selected a risk profile 1, and I'll get into what those risk profiles are here in the next slide. But that's kind of the baseline, and that's what they wanted to target. And then they wanted to ensure that they were moving up that risk profile level over time, and this was kind of a starting point. And we'll go to the takeaways after I walk through the case study. Perfect. So again, that was the driver. They wanted to ensure that they were gut checking their environment, and their outcome was that they kind of passed with the target profile that they had picked. The target profile they picked was level 1. Again, this is what Xantrion has deemed kind of a healthy baseline against the NIST cybersecurity framework. So it's the bare minimum, really, of what we recommend any modern business have in place in order to keep their business secure. There's higher levels of target profiles. There's a level 2 and a level 3 that we've developed. We could always develop custom levels down the road, but this is kind of how we've built the basics of our structure. Level 2 and level 3 are increasingly harder to get to and require a lot more investment in resources and time and potential inconveniences to your staff in order to achieve, but they are worth pursuing if you feel like it's worth the investment. But starting with 1 is where we always recommend. From there, we now that we understand what the outcome is, desired outcome is, we interview people in compliance and people in technology to understand how they do what they do and if they have all of the tick boxes checked. And then we score those answers against the 83 risk mitigation questions that we have in our framework. And some of these are from NIST, most of these are from NIST, but some of them are borrowed elsewhere, real world examples, and also some other frameworks as well. So it's kind of our own custom formula that we've developed. Once we've scored all of those answers against the 83 checkboxes, we develop kind of an overall score, an easy to understand distilled grade, A, B, C, for how you did against the risk profile that you wanted to achieve. Once we've given you that score, we develop a list of improvements and recommendations that you can implement to either reach a higher score on that same profile, or even better, move up to the next risk profile next year when we do this again. So we create, based on those recommendations, we help you create a 3, 6, and 12-month action plan, going after typically the low-hanging fruit first, and then moving on from there, and making sure that when it comes 12 months from now, you've wrapped up all the recommendations, and then you start the whole process over again. This is we typically recommend an annual frequency here. That's again our recommendation, but you could do 18 months, you could do 24 months, as long as it's defined and adhered to, and you meet that cadence with regularity. That's written down somewhere. That's the most important thing, because you will show overall improvement, and these frameworks evolve over time. So you want to make sure that you are working against the most up-to-date framework and not just resting on your laurels on the older frameworks.
And then some takeaways for this specific company.
Yes, so fared pretty well. I think they got like an A- or something like that in the final scorecard. So they fared pretty well against the base target, but they want to do better. So they want to do better next year. So we put together an action plan, and we identified some significant gaps in their policies. Their BCP and incident response plan were out of date and lacking some type of formal annual review. So we recommended that they implement that and make sure that they're staying on top of it. And also recommending that these should be done regularly and done annually going forward. And that's kind of the key takeaways that we had there.
Okay. Thank you, Darren, for that. Brandon, you also have a case study.
Yes, thank you, Heather. From the sort of reactive side, as we're calling it, this is a good example of an incident that we often see across all of our client base where a risk assessment might have been very valuable on the front end. We had a client that was a small manufacturing facility, and that facility had a vendor that it worked with on a regular basis and to whom it paid invoices electronically on a regular basis through wiring or ACH transactions. So the facility got an email from their vendor point of contact that mentioned that it had recently changed banks and to send payment according to the new routing instructions. Our client did so, and they didn't think anything else about it. So as is too often the case, the vendor reached back months later to inquire why the invoice hadn't been paid, to which our client said, "We did pay it." And it was then that it was discovered that the vendor's email system had been compromised and that a bad actor had sent our client an email from the vendor contact's email account to reroute and misdirect the funds to the bad actor's account. So we immediately did everything we could. We filled out an IC3 complaint with the FBI. We contacted the local Secret Service office. We contacted local law enforcement and worked with the participating banks to attempt to claw back the funds, because sometimes that can be done. But as we had expected, months had gone by, too much time had passed, and the money was gone. So now our client, the facility, and its trusted and longtime vendor have to work through that with their relationship and negotiate or potentially litigate who bears the risk of that loss. So in this particular case, the disputed payments totaled about $200,000 over multiple invoices. But those losses can be much more, depending on what the invoice amounts are and the number of payments that are made before the compromise is identified.
You've got some kind of learned bullet points that you've put together here. As we move to those, I do have a quick question for you. I know that your case study was a manufacturing facility and Darren's case study was another industry, but is there an industry where you are seeing more attacks, or is it just pretty much everybody?
Great question, Heather. This type of business email compromise happens all the time. And it happens regardless of industry or the size of the business. The bullet you see on the slide provided shows that one report says that 70% of organizations were the targets of BEC attacks in 2023, and roughly a third of those attacks were successful. This happens across all industries and across all business sizes. Of course, the opportunity for risk could have a greater surface area in such industries and markets where there's more electronics payments being made on a frequent and hurried basis. Industries that come to mind might be in construction or claims processing, but as the slide shows, it's pretty much all across the board and it's on the rise.
Your second bullet point's painful that an employee mistake is likely the reason. Darren, Brandon, your thoughts here. What can we do about people like me?
Sure. One of the things that we're going to talk about is that, as Darren mentioned, the technological solution evolves. It's a duel between, it's sort of like virus and antivirus, right? And what was sufficient yesterday may not be sufficient today. And, the biggest enemy is human error. We're humans and we're in a hurry and we're trying to operate a business. And sometimes we don't notice that phishing email, or sometimes, as was my case, it wasn't a phishing email at all. There was nothing to detect. It actually came from the vendor's email account. And so many data breaches are caused by human error, employee mistakes, which is why I think, as we talked about before, that comprehensive assessment is important. There are technological solutions that can put in place to filter out suspicious emails and to reduce the emails that your employees are are subjected to. But there's also a means to increase training and awareness among your employees and to make this front of mind in their organization. So when they're doing their day-to-day business, they're thinking about this on a regular basis. And so the best line of defense is what we call defense in depth. It's not any one thing, but it's multiple safeguards that are both the front and the last line of defense that work together to mitigate your risk.
And you may have covered this and I missed it, but is there a way to tell if there's a difference between a phishing attack or like a system compromise?
There is a difference between the two. You know, a phishing attack is when someone sends an email that looks a lot like it came from the person you expected it from. Maybe it's their email address, but you know, it's a 1 instead of a lowercase l. Or maybe, you know, it's coming from someone that you wouldn't expect to know, but it's an organization you know, but the logo is just a slightly different that you might not notice. Those are emails that are coming from outside that person's network, but designed and sometimes with enough detailed information to trick you into thinking that it is coming from that network. Whereas a network compromise is where someone's actually in their email system and has access to their email and has sent you an email from that system. And so there was nothing you could have suspected by viewing the email alone. And what I like about the case study that we said earlier, and what's interesting about that example, is it shows how a cyber risk assessment that it shows that can introduce and recommend safeguards could have prevented that, regardless of whether it was a phishing email or a compromise. If you had put, you know, if a cyber risk assessment may have looked at your payment instructions and your policies and procedures for wiring and making payments and suggested things like when your vendor says they're changing their bank account, pick up the telephone and call them, not based on the number in the email, but based on your Rolodex or you know, what you have in your desk, and say, did you just send me this email and change the banking account, and confirm that? It doesn't matter if that was a phishing email or a network compromise, that would have helped. However, I talked to a former FBI contact of mine a few weeks ago who says, you know, in 6 months, they can compromise with AI and everything else. They can compromise the telephones too. So having multi-factor authentication, having telephone confirmation of changing of accounts, having that defense, in depth really helps mitigate this risk. And of course, we also know that you've got to do business, and maybe you're handling thousands of payments a day, right? And so that's where the assessment is helpful, because it's a way to show where you are, where you want to be, what you can do, and let you, the company, decide what you want to invest in that both fits your compliance and your risk tolerance, as well as your budget priorities, and quite frankly, the speed of business.
Darren, would what Brandon just talked about be covered in your level 1?
Yeah,
assessment?
absolutely. Yes. Yeah. And it's important to note that a phishing attempt like what Brandon was describing can lead to a business compromise. It's often how they get in the first place.
All right. Again, just a reminder to everybody, we're starting to see some questions come in. If you have questions, please put them in the Q&A, not the chat. And then our administrator will see them a little bit quicker. And we're going to get to those questions after we cover. We're just going to go through a few takeaways, and then we'll start addressing your questions. So the next slide is our takeaways. And Brandon, we're going to start. Let's see, we'll start with you, and then Darren, you handle a couple of them, and then I think, Brandon, you're going to get sweep and get the last one.
Sounds great. What I like about this first takeaway, and I previewed it a little bit in my response in the previous slide, is that it recognizes that you can't be 100% secure, right? Plus, your company has limited time and resources while you're also trying to run your business. And so a proper assessment, and what's good about the type of thing that Darren does, as well as when we're working together and what we do, is it allows you to evaluate where you are now, to determine where you want to be, and to identify in a risk-based manner what improvements you can make today based on your needs, resources, your compliance obligations, your budget, and other factors to improve your cybersecurity posture, and which ones you can schedule out for a later time. And what I like about the process that Darren described is, you know, there's different levels, and, you know, let's get to level 1. That's what your company can handle today. And then when you're ready, move on to level 2. Of course, you've got to handle compliance obligations first. So from a risk-based perspective, you probably want to start there, but there's plenty of opportunity to have best practices that may not be legally required, but that do reduce your threat level, your threat service, and prevent you from losses that might otherwise occur.
Thank you for that, Darren.
Yeah, so as we mentioned earlier, you really want to be proactive here. You don't want to be in the reactive mode that Brandon described of doing this after the fact because you didn't have these controls in place. So consider conducting these assessments before an incident occurs to significantly reduce the costs of such an incident. Also utilize a third party. So we're experts in the space, have those experts perform those assessments as self-assessments and automated scans can leave considerable gaps. Third, follow a standard assessment framework. So we, again, use the NIST framework, but there's plenty of other great ones out there. Just as long as it's a industry trusted and evolving framework, you should be fine. And lastly, perform these assessments regularly. Again, you want to do this about annually. That's what we recommend, but 18-24 months is perfectly fine as long as you're writing it down in your policies and you commit to that cadence. That's the best thing you can be doing. So you'll show constant progress against that evolving framework. And you should fail these framework tests initially. These assessments, you should find plenty of gaps that you want to cover, and that's good news. You don't want to have this report come back and say everything's peachy, there's nothing to do, because as Brandon said, there's never 100%. So you always want to keep moving up that ladder.
Darren brings up a good point of expect to fail. That means you make an improvement. As I tell my 9-year-old daughter, if you answer every question correctly on your test immediately, then you need a harder test, right? And that just shows you're climbing up the cybersecurity maturity ladder. For this last takeaway, as we mentioned before, the best assessment from an outside vendor perspective, in my opinion, involves both legal and technical experts working together to comprehensively and holistically assess your cybersecurity posture and perform and recommend comprehensive solutions to address them. But similarly, on the company side, the best assessment and the best team to participate involves a cross-functional team within your organization, those that work day to day with your data and those that understand the company's legal and regulatory compliance environment and compliance history. So it may be IT, legal, HR, operations, marketing, compliance. And if you're a smaller organization, maybe those are some of the same people who just wear multiple hats. In larger organizations, it may be spread out over multiple departments or divisions. But having that cross-functional team to participate, for us and the assessors to understand exactly how this information practices, both the problems and the solutions may impact your business, what challenges you might have to certain recommended solutions is critically important. So we can suggest and recommend solutions that are feasible for you and your business. And that's why we always, as I mentioned before, start our risk assessments by having a kickoff to determine everybody that should be involved, who has what roles, and what that assessment will look like going forward so that everybody's on the same page.
And Brandon, since you're a lawyer, I'm going to direct this one at you. I have to imagine if you have a cybersecurity hack, breach, and there is ensuing litigation down the road, one of the first questions you're going to get asked is, did you do a cybersecurity assessment?
Especially in the regulatory environment, often we'll get those questions. From a particular data breach, it depends on the industry and how sophisticated the legal and regulatory environment is. I will say that regardless of the legal and regulatory environment, the fact that you've done so is helpful. Because even if you don't have a regulatory legal requirement or compliance obligation, and even if you comply with the data breach notification statutes, which is really what a lot of the teeth are in terms of notifying individuals in the AG promptly and within the statutory deadlines that exist in all 50 states. You're seeing a lot of plaintiffs' attorneys, every time you notify those individuals, you begin to see the class action complaints. And they're not just alleging a violation of that statute. They're alleging all sorts of common law torts, such as negligence and other common law claims that could get to, were you being reasonable in your security practices, especially if you said you take reasonable security practices in your privacy policy, which is a whole nother area of compliance obligation with the FTC and unfair and deceptive practices. So to answer your question, it would be important when you have such an incident very valuable for you to be able to say, yes, we do cybersecurity assessments on a periodic and regular basis.
All right, thank you. You and Darren have covered a lot of ground here in 35 minutes. Thank you for that. You've left us time for Q&A, and we do have some Q&A, so I'm going to start asking those questions, and you guys can decide who wants to take or you both want to comment. The first question is, are there any legal requirements for service providers to provide a SOC report to their customers?
So if that one's for me, I think. I'm not aware off the top of my head of a very direct obligation that says service providers must provide SOC 2 Type 2. However, there are multiple laws that place obligations on what we call the controllers of the data, which is who the service providers provide services to, and the processors, who are the service processors that are receiving that data on their behalf. And there's obligations in both those cases to have certain data protections and ensure that the service providers you share that information are equally bound to certain protections. So it may be that a certain level of cybersecurity analysis is required of the service provider's customer, and so they're flowing that down to you. Or it may be a contractual requirement where the company's preference for making sure that you're protecting their data is specifically a SOC 2 type 2 report. Sometimes you see other ISO reports. It just depends on the industry and, quite frankly, usually the service provider's customers' preferences and tolerance for cybersecurity risk. Darren, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I can piggyback on that a little bit. So we have a SOC 2 Type 2 attestation, and we'll provide the summary report to a customer if they ask for it. I'm not aware of any legal requirement to provide the full report, and oftentimes we don't want to provide the full report because it can kind of expose some of our secret sauce, and maybe even if that report ever made its way into the wrong hands, someone could use it against us in order to kind of navigate our technical controls. So we want to keep that in-house and a lid on it if possible.
That's right. Often I see service providers saying, we're not going to provide you the full report, but they'll provide, as you said, a summary or an opinion letter, or allow you to view it perhaps and have access to it, but not actually deliver it to you because, as you said, sort of disclosing the findings, if there are vulnerabilities, could introduce even further vulnerability by that being out there.
Exactly.
Thank you. Next question. Could you both provide some tips for choosing a partner to do a cybersecurity assessment?
Yeah, I'll start with this one. So you want to fully vet whoever is performing this assessment. There's lots of automated tools out there and easy checklists that someone could get their hands on and be kind of a newer company into the space. So work with a vendor that has been in the space for a long time, that's mature, has a deep enough bench to have the experience necessary to have seen all the things in order to report on those things. Also having somebody with some type of attestation or certification like a SOC 2 Type 2 like Xantrion has is important, and fully vet the references that are provided to you by that vendor so that you can speak to other clients, real clients who have gone through this before and have come out the other side positively.
I would add to that. I mean, I think the things you want to look for is experience, expertise, in detail, and be wary of those who claim too much. This is a fast and moving landscape. And I'm thinking about sort of on the privacy side of my business, a lot of clients, they go to one of those websites that automatically, feeds and drafts a privacy policy for them, for example. And, they pay $100. Well, that doesn't understand the complexities of your business and your industry and your information practices, right? So I would be wary of, if you're going to do this, let's do it right and get the value out of the investment that you're spending. And so I would be wary of cybersecurity assessments that seem to do a one size fits all for everybody in every industry. You want to find somebody and ask questions such as, what expertise do you have to inform it? How familiar are you with our industry and our types of businesses? How many have you done before? And be wary of something that's super cheap. I mean, you may not need the Rolls Royce, but you want to know that somebody's actually taking some time to really investigate your company and provide you valuable input. So that'd be my advice on picking a vendor.
Darren, in your presentation, you mentioned how you often encourage your clients to do this annually. One of the questions that's come in is, how long should an assessment typically take?
Yeah, so this will vary depending on the size of the company, what their objectives are, how involved they are, who their IT is. So there's a lot of variables at play, but typically we see these take anywhere between 2 to 4 weeks. There's a lengthy interview process. There's a little bit of back and forth there to confirm our understanding of the environment. And then there's reporting and coming to a mutual agreement as to what we want to do as our next steps. So yeah, 2 to 4 weeks is a typical ballpark estimate, but again, it can vary, especially if it's your first time going through it. It may take a little bit longer than future iterations.
Sure, that makes sense. All right, Brandon, listen up. This one's got some length to it. Is there a difference in penalty if a company only conducts self-assessments and doesn't catch major risks or vulnerabilities and a breach occurs, versus a company who uses a third-party expert and a breach occurs? To simplify, is there any credit given for companies who use third-party experts if a breach occurs?
Sure, and it's a good question. And, I don't think in the current framework for most companies that it is, like the penalty guidelines where you get certain penalties and credits. And it's not really that black and white. I do think it's more of a facts and circumstances sort of decision that gets made. I do know that depending on your company and the industry it's in and the laws and regulations that apply to it, there are some requirements, particularly in some critical infrastructures, that require the assessment to be done by an independent third party, right? The concern being that if you're doing it in-house or internally, whether true or not, the concern is that you may be giving yourself the answers that you want to give yourself. And so having that independent third party in some cases is required. In other cases, in the facts and circumstances, if you do end up in the unfortunate circumstance of being in litigation and you're being accused of being negligent in your cybersecurity practices, I think the fact that you had an independent third party do the assessment, as opposed to the same IT team that was protecting the data in the first place, definitely weighs in your favor in the consideration of all the facts and circumstances involved.
Okay. This next one might be in your realm as well. It's on reporting. There was mention of reporting to certain government and law enforcement agencies as a post-breach response. What can one expect as to the extent of involvement of those agencies post-breach and typical outcomes from their involvement, if any?
I hate to give the typical lawyer response again on this, but the answer is it depends, right? I think in a post-breach world, you're going to have certain notifications to individuals, and you may have certain notification obligations to a primary federal or state regulator, to the attorney general, and in certain sizes of breaches to consumer reporting agencies as well. And so when you make these regulatory notifications, it's going to depend a lot on the circumstances of the breach and how you describe that in your notification. It may also depend on the particular regulator. Some of them are very hands-off. Some of them follow up with a lot of questions. And so it really depends on the facts and circumstances and what particular entities you're reporting to as to whether they're going to say, thank you very much, looks like everything's above board and the job is done, or whether they're going to dig a little deeper.
All right. Thank you for that. Darren, I've got a question for you. It's been floating around in my mind. How much does something like this cost? How much does an assessment cost? You can't use Brandon's lawyer answer of it depends.
So it does depend a little bit on the
Okay.
size and of the company and how deep you really want to go. But typically it's around $5,000. You may see other companies offer this for around $10,000. It really, again, it depends on how deep they want to go and how thorough they are and what their business model is. So if your business model is just this, you may see a little bit more upfront for the cost. But if this is kind of a gateway into more services, it may be discounted.
Okay. What about AI? It seems to be such a growing topic and focus of both the tech industry and just like everybody now. How is that going to play a role here?
Sure. So I'll tackle this one first. So AI and machine learning is really evolving cybersecurity threats and the protections and the assessments that we're providing. So automated and sophisticated attacks are becoming increasingly common these days. So like I was mentioning about multi-factor authentication no longer being the saving grace for all of your technology. It is now kind of trivial for somebody to turn on a more advanced, sophisticated attack that's leveraging machine learning. Likewise, language is now very easy to fake. That's what ChatGPT is all about. It's a language model. So it used to be you could spot the bad English and that was the bad actor, but that's no longer the case. So you need to be very careful. Sometimes it's actually it's in the opposite direction now. If it's too well written, it might be fake. So just keep your eye out for that as well. So thankfully, though, our responses also are able to leverage AI and machine learning, both in alerting us that there's a problem. So we have very sophisticated alerting systems that are provided by Microsoft to us. There's other companies out there that provide this, but for Xantrion, we have Microsoft providing very sophisticated AI ML type responses to, hey, this person usually logs in from San Francisco, but all of a sudden they're logging in from the other side of the world. And that's impossible travel. So how could that be? That's an alert that we think is suspicious and should be acted upon. So both in the alerting and our responses, the reports that we're able to generate very quickly to figure out exactly how deep this bad actor has gotten, what they've gotten access to, maybe how they got it in the first place, that's all expedited quite a bit by the tools that are now available to us. So a little bit of a cat and mouse game going on there, but we're always trying to stay on top of this.
All right, thank you for that. We've got just a couple more questions. We have just 12 minutes or so left. So if you've got something else that's on your mind, be sure to put it in the Q&A, not the chat, if you don't mind. We'll see it sooner in the Q&A and we'll get to your question. Brandon, if you can, what is the example of compliance risks that law firms help clients discover and mitigate, and why is this important?
Well, depending on the industry you're in, if you're a healthcare entity or a vendor to a healthcare entity, or even if you're a quote unquote non-regulated entity, you're increasingly seeing requirements for quote unquote reasonable security procedures and what that means, and coming to some consensus about what de facto reasonable security procedures mean. You're also seeing it in a lot of state legislation. So from a legal perspective, we're helping you understand where your cybersecurity posture is and how it measures up to what legal and regulatory obligations that you may need to comply with. And that's not just, do you have the right firewalls? It also is, because data breach is human error, what policies and procedures do you have in place? What do you do to make sure your employees are aware of them? What does your privacy policy say that you do? And do you actually do and don't do those things? And so there's a lot of areas where there is legal and regulatory compliance risk for a company that a cybersecurity risk assessment that involves both legal and technical vendors can help you spot and remediate.
All right. Darren, this last one is kind of two-pronged. Does employee security training really work? And is multi-factor authentication enough?
Yeah, so I'll answer the second one first. So as I've been kind of mentioning, no, multi-factor is not enough anymore. It's still the one thing. If you're going to pick one thing to go after that, absolutely. But we've seen at our own clients very sophisticated attacks on multi-factor. So what they're doing is they're tricking you into entering your credentials into a website. That's not new, usually from some type of phishing attempt. And then they're grabbing in real time, they're putting that into Microsoft's website, seeing what the MFA prompt is, feeding that to you in the fake website that you're seeing, and now you're kind of hijacked. So they're in there, they usually add their own cell phone as multi-factor after they get in. That's one of the first things we do after we notice a compromise, to remove all the devices from multi-factor that we don't recognize. So unfortunately, no, it's not quite enough anymore. But there are additional controls you can put in place in order to prevent this. Like anything security related, this usually means an uptick in employee inconvenience, just like MFA was right when it came out. So there's going to be more that your employees are going to have to know how to navigate, and there may be a little bit less, maybe there may be a few more hurdles into getting into your data, which is a good thing, but it's it's a compromise. And your other question was, does training still work, or does it really work? So we, as Xantrion, enroll all of our clients in a cybersecurity training program, and part of that program includes proactive phishing training. So we, once a month, to every single client, every single user at one of our clients, they get a fake phishing email. And if they do something wrong on that phishing email, if they click the link, they forward it, they reply back to it, they do any of those things in that email or open the attachment, they do any of those things, they've failed the test, and they get notified, hey, you failed the phishing attempt. You're now automatically enrolled in additional training. No one wants to do additional training, so they remember that slap on the wrist. They don't want to go through that again. So they typically do better the next time they see those phishing attempts, and they have their guard way up. And we increase the complexity of these phishing attempts over time, and we still see a steady decrease in the amount of folks at these companies that click those links. There's always somebody that clicks something. It's never a flat line. If it is, they're not sophisticated enough. But we always see kind of a steady decrease at every one of our clients a year, 2 years down the road once they've got this program off the ground.
Oh, that's good. That's painful.
At my old firm, at one firm I worked at, I had an old partner, and I said I never had to worry about him from a cybersecurity perspective because he never printed out an email. He never opened an email. His secretary would do it, print it out for him, and put it on his desk. And so I never had to worry about him clicking on a phishing message. But for what it's worth, I mean, even at Maynard Nexsen, we'd go through the same phishing training and awareness exercise to make sure we're doing what we can to be responsible from that perspective.
It uses every brain cell I have, but I do pay attention to them now. Darren, Brandon, you guys have done a great job, I think, of telling us about what a cybersecurity assessment is, why we need one, how to get one, what it might be. You've covered a lot of ground, and we're grateful for that. I know that we are going to, for those of you listening, we are going to provide this link to this so you can go back and watch it. We're recording now. And if you have additional questions, it's never too late to reach out to either Brandon or Darren or any of our teams and ask your questions. Be happy to give them to you. As you've heard them say today, the risk is here. We might as well plan for it. So on behalf of Xantrion and Maynard Nexsen teams, we thank you for joining us. We appreciate your time. We made it under 60 minutes, and we hope you have a great rest of the week. Thanks for joining us.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Heather, Darren.